The worst infestations that I've seen with worms in my chicken flocks were in my free-range chickens. And the reason is because they're pecking around in feces and in the soil, and it is super easy for them to pick up the eggs through another animal's contaminated feces. That's typically how worms are spread, via eggs and feces. First time that I saw a live worm in my chicken's poop, I was absolutely mortified. And then I learned that chickens can have worm loads that are so heavy that those worms can make their way into the oviduct and into eggs, and you can crack open an egg and there can be a worm in there. Okay, so that's never actually happened to me, but I've seen people post about it places, and I'm horrified enough that after having seen a live worm in chicken poop before, so I know that I've dealt with worms on the property. I have to treat my dogs for worms. Worms are just common in the environment where I live. I now treat preventatively, just like for mites and lice, twice a year for worms, but I use the same medication for all of those things. Another real danger of worms, though, is that if a worm load is also too heavy, it can actually cause issues like impacted crops. Also, it's important for me to share with y'all that I was under the impression that it takes worms like an extended period of time to mature and become like long roundworms in chickens, until I had a chicken who was like 16 weeks old who pooped out a live worm once. And then I was really super surprised to see how young chickens can be and still have worm infestations. Some other symptoms that we might see that our chickens have worms are pale comb as nutrients are being sucked, poor or slow weight gain, lethargy, sitting off by them. I know like a lot of these parasite issues have very similar symptoms, but they're all basically doing the same thing, just from different areas in the body. There are several different types of worms. The most common worms that we're gonna see are roundworms. Roundworms make their homes in the intestinal tract of chickens. There's also capillary worms, which usually make their home in the esophagus, crop, and intestine. Gape worms, one of the more common worms in chickens. They live in the esophagus, and they cause chickens to do sort of like a mouth open gaping motion. They can't breathe well. And so you might notice that they're sort of gasping for air. They're shaking their head. Tapeworms are also less common, but not impossible, because they actually require an intermediate host, something like an earthworm, slug, snail, or other bug. And then there are also eye worms, which are really small white roundworms who make their home in the corner of the eye. They can also cause inflammation in the eye and symptoms that appear to be respiratory in nature. Eye worms are spread via infected cockroaches. The only way to know for sure which worms you're dealing with is via doing a fecal test. One thing that is important to note while attempting to deworm our flock is that not all dewormers treat all worms. So it's important to know what we're treating so that we can choose an effective treatment. Ivermectin is probably the best broad spectrum treatment for worms. However, with ivermectin treatment, with any of these treatments for worms, it's going to be necessary to treat once and then again 10 days later to capture anything that may have hatched in the meantime. Egg withdrawal time in ivermectin is about 14 days. That seems to be what's agreed upon in the chicken keeping community. Valbazin can also be used off-label to treat worms in poultry. It is effective against roundworms, cecal worms, gape worms, tapeworms, and capillary worms. And the dosage with valbazin is about 1/4 cc for bantams and 1/2 cc for standard sized birds, given one time and then again 10 days later. Egg withdrawal time is suggested at 14 days. Safeguard, the oral medication that's typically used for goats, is also an effective treatment for worms in chickens, although there is conflicting information about how to give this. In some places you will read that you can put 3 3Cs of Safeguard into 1 gallon of water and mix that fresh daily and administer for 5 days. And the egg withdrawal time for Safeguard is 14 days. You're going to want to do that first treatment days 1 through 5 and then treat again 10 days after that last day of treatment. I hope that you never have to deal with worms. I hope that you never live through the horror of seeing live worms in your chicken's poop. But in the event that you do, I would invite you to have at least one of these dewormers on hand, if not 2. It's always advisable to have a fecal test run to know what types of worms that you're treating so that you can use the most effective medication, and also to help prevent parasite resistance. But chances are that at least once in your chicken keeping career, you are likely going to deal with these parasites. And when you do, it will be really nice to know what you're looking at and the course of action so that you can treat without anxiety.